Hello everyone, thank you for joining. We have Ray Camden with us. Thank you, Ray, for speaking to the group today. And next month we have Jensen doing an overview on VueJs, and in March we have Jesse doing an overview with Nuxt and VueJs. So feel free to follow our events page so that you can RSVP for the same. So with that said, Ray, it's all yours.
Okay. Can you all hear me all right? Can you all hear me? Someone could chat, someone could wave.
Yeah, we are able to hear you.
Okay, cool. All right, I'm gonna share my screen and you should be seeing my screen. And okay, hopefully you're seeing the giant slide right now. So first off, thank you for the invitation. I definitely appreciate it. It's been fun. I try every now and then to talk on a topic where I don't actually know much about it, because then it kind of forces me to do a deep dive into it. And that's how it was with this particular topic, Gridsome. So just real quick, my name is Raymond Camden. I'm a developer evangelist for here. We do a lot of stuff with location. So if you're interested in doing routing, geolocation, mapping, and things like that, we have some really cool tools with a great free tier. I also build every demo with cats just because that makes sense to me. If you want to reach out and contact me, my blog is at raymondcamden.com. And you can also hit me up on Twitter at Raymond Camden. My DMs are open. I do offer my help to anyone I can. So definitely feel free to reach out to me, and I will do my best to help you out. And I'll also say everything I'm showing today, every bit of code and all the slide decks, etc., this will all be on a GitHub repo. So if for some reason you have to leave, check the recording later, and I share that particular repository URL where you can grab all the demos and stuff like that. So with that in mind, my kind of game plan for how I want to tackle this particular topic tonight is a little bit backwards. I want to actually start off by giving you a summary of what I think about Gridsome. Again, I've spent the last month or so, and sometime before that as well, just playing and trying my best to learn. And you may be shocked to know that as a developer, I have opinions, and I'm going to share my opinions of you at the beginning, because I feel like I should do so, because it kind of colors how I talk about things and what particular aspects of Gridsome I'm talking about. I'll start off with a kind of a brief section about what Gridsome is, and then we'll spend most of our time talking about the how, actually building things with Gridsome. I'm not covering every particular topic tonight, but kind of hitting the high points and trying to give you more of a feeling for how Gridsome works, so you can make the decision if it's something that you want to learn going forward. And then I'm going to wrap up with just sharing a few links in terms of where you could go to learn more about it. Now, when I'm sharing my screen, I don't see the chat. So if you ask a question, I may not see it till the end, but definitely feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to answer. So, like I said, I'm starting kind of backwards by giving you a summary. I have been very passionate about the Jamstack and static site generators in general. And what I have found is that I typically have a very warm or very cold reaction to most of these tools. It's rarely in the middle. I either think it's great or I think it's really not for me. I won't say it's bad, I'll just say it's not for me. This particular one was pretty interesting. It has a lot going for it, especially being Vue related, and it has some very interesting features. I really, really struggled with some of the docs, and that is kind of a pet peeve for me, because sometimes docs are kind of left to sit there and just they're considered not as important as everything else. And for me, it's like the most important thing. Like I would rather you have less features than better docs. And there were a couple things with Gridsome that just were painfully hard to do. And that could have been just my poor reading of the docs. But there were definitely like some issues where things were not fleshed out. And I think that's probably my biggest complaint about Gridsome, is that it just needs a bit more love in the docs. And I think once it gets there, it will be really, really solid. So let me actually talk now about what Gridsome is and why I think it's interesting. So Gridsome is a static site generator. Those of us who work in this space have been using the Jamstack name lately, so JavaScript APIs and markup, because it's a better name than static sites, because that tends to make people think that they're getting like a boring, plain, simple old HTML, and that's just simply not the case. It's not only a static site generator, it actually turns your final application into a Vue single page application, and can be used for a variety of things. I will say the PWA support seemed a bit light, but there is some support there for that. And the big selling point of Gridsome, and what makes it kind of fascinating, is that it's powered by GraphQL. So it has a GraphQL server built into it. You don't have to add one. And you could use that as you build a site. And you'll see an example of what I mean by that later on. But it's pretty cool. You can find out more at gridsome.org. That's the main landing page for the project. So in terms of prereqs, in terms of things that you should know going in, you absolutely want to know Vue. You don't have to be an expert at VueJS. And Vue, out of all the big frameworks out there, to me, is the easiest to learn. So, but you definitely want to have seen Vue and worked with Vue a bit. I'm not an expert at Vue. I think I'm just really passionate about it. I'm a strong intermediate user, but I absolutely think you could be a beginner at Vue, just know the basic syntax, and you will know enough to work with Gridsome. GraphQL. So this is what the docs have to say about that. Knowing how GraphQL works is a plus, but not required. Gridsome is a great way to learn it. As a presenter, you're never supposed to read directly from the slide, but I thought it kind of made sense there. I'm going to strongly disagree with that particular statement. GraphQL is radically different from working with SQL or working with most APIs. I think it's really neat. I learned a bit about GraphQL like 6-7 months ago, more than that actually, at my previous job. I read one book on it because we were thinking about using GraphQL in our APIs, and it never came to fruition. So I don't use GraphQL on a daily basis. I've seen it. So if you consider me a rank beginner, I can make things work. But it's definitely kind of painful, and I'll show you a way to make that a little bit less painful. I would say if you don't know GraphQL, then you really want to read at least a couple of what are GraphQL blog posts. The syntax is really radically different than what you've seen before. It's a great thing to learn. It definitely applies outside of Gridsome. I would absolutely recommend learning GraphQL. But if you know nothing about it, then I would suggest spending some time before you try to tackle Gridsome. Yeah, so you can get by with copy and paste, but you're going to struggle, and you don't want to use something if you're struggling. Now, if for some reason you know GraphQL and you despise it, then you probably don't want to use Gridsome, because it's like beating heart of its power is working with GraphQL. So just going to keep that in mind. So let's talk about how you use Gridsome. So number one, you're going to do a quick npm install, and I won't read that command on there, but that will give you the CLI. Once you have the CLI, Gridsome create something, where something is the name of the folder. The CLI does support a couple of scaffolding apps out there. The one that it doesn't support now is a bare option. So by that I mean the Vue CLI supports creating a very bare bones application, but the default has hello world type stuff in it. Gridsome does not support that. When I mentioned it to the Gridsome Twitter account, they said they recognized that that was needed and that it's something that they're going to add. But so if you want like the default, you have that. There's a couple other things that you could scaffold, for example, a blog. Anyway, so once you scaffold that, and I will point out, the CLI is a little bit slow. I use Windows subsystem for Linux, and that is kind of slow when it comes to node operations or just a lot of file I/O. So I noticed whenever a project uses NPM to fetch a bunch of stuff, it'll be a bit slower compared to the native command line like cmd.exe, or if you're on a Mac, just the native terminal. Gridsome seems to be a little bit more slow. On the initial project creation, typically for me, I'm seeing times of about 90 seconds. But now most people will probably make one project and then work on it. To me, it was a little bit painful because I was making a sample after a sample after a sample. But you'll notice I'm not going to wait too long for it today because it'd be kind of boring to make y'all wait for 90 seconds. Once you have that application, you can go into that folder and then just run Gridsome develop. When you're done working with it, you run Gridsome build, and that will output your code at a folder called dist. And then at that point, you can just literally go ahead and push that to wherever you want. So I said I wasn't going to make you sit here and wait, but I will kind of show you what it looks like. I'm just going into a temp folder, and let me know if this terminal is a bit too small. And I'm going to say Gridsome, and I am going to say create, and I will call it January 22nd. So it's going to begin scaffolding the application and begin installing the dependencies. And again, like I said, this was typically about 90 or so seconds. Now, because I complained about that, it's probably going to be a little bit quicker. I do want to show you it running, so I may actually let this finish. My plan was to create one this morning, and I totally forgot about that. But we will see how long this takes, and hopefully it won't be too slow. If not, I may actually cheat and go into one of the demo applications. And it's thinking, it's like, yeah, so I was worried it would be like too fast because I complained about it being slow. And I think it's actually going a little bit slower than normal. So I am not going to wait there. I am actually going to go into one of our examples and just kind of show you what it looks like to run it. We won't worry about the code in there. Let's see how you're doing. You're just sitting there thinking, all right, I'll go back here. Once you actually have the thing scaffolded out, you can run Gridsome develop, and it's going to start parsing the files. It's going to fire up a server, and we will see any second now it output a URL. And this is still moving along 3 of 4. Yeah, like I said, it's a little bit slow, but it seems more slow tonight because I'm presenting. Yeah, typically this develop process is like, let's say 8 seconds. So everything is going a little bit slower just to make me look bad. That's the story I'm going with. All right, and done. So cool. So it will fire up, it will give you the URL, tell you where it's at. It will also tell you where the GraphQL Explorer is. I'll talk a bit more about that later when we get the data. But now if I wanted to, I could go to my browser and go to localhost 8080, and you will see a demo that we're not really supposed to see until later, but that's okay. All right, let's go back to the first one. Yeah, it's still doing. Yeah, don't blame Gridsome for that. Blame Windows subsystem for Linux and whatever in the heck, whatever in the heck is kind of slowing things down a bit for me today. Again, in my testing, I typically saw 90 seconds, which is not too bad for scaffolding a new application. This is just being embarrassingly bad right now. So once you have the application, and actually let me go back to the one that's done. If I kill the server and do Gridsome build, this will actually spit out the final folder in a directory called dist. We'll see how long this is. This should be pretty quick too, although I've been horrible at estimating my times today, so we'll see. And you can be done. You're going to be done. Oh, it's optimizing a Terser plugin. That's very important. And there we go. 32 seconds. That's not too bad. If I go into this, I can see stuff. And if I were to deploy this with a tool like Now, it will actually put everything up there if my Now CLI was working. I'm just not going to do that right now. Again, going back to that initial build, this is just being very, very naughty tonight. Expect about 90 seconds or less typically to scaffold a new application. All right, you have let me down, so we'll go on from there. So once you have an application done, one of the first things that you may want to do is start scaffolding out pages. So pages are just single file components, which again, if you have been using Vue, that should not be new to you. You're already kind of used to that syntax. When you start adding these, you get automatic routing. So when I make a page called foo, for example, I'll get automatic routes for that particular component. It also makes use of Vue Meta. I've been using Vue for a while, and Vue Meta is not something I have used in the past, but essentially gives you an easier way to work with the metadata that you see when you view source on a web page, all the stuff in the head, essentially. Pages can also be made dynamically, and I have an example of that way towards the end of this. And just to give you some examples of how that routing works, when I just have a component named foo, it's going to give me a route at /foo. If I wanted to, I could actually build a folder for foo and create an index.vue in there, and I get the same URL. If I make a folder called foo and then put something beneath that, like a goo, then I have a URL of foo/goo. And Gridsome is fine with whatever you do. So what I'm going to do, and hopefully this darn thing is done. Oh my goodness. I don't necessarily want to use one of my other examples. I am just going to go in here and fire up a whole other different one just because it is being so bad for me, and see if that's just maybe hanging on something that I don't know about. So I'm going to call it Jan 22nd 2. And oh, okay, there you go. I complained and it's done. So I'm going to show you the folder for January 22nd. And this is it. Let's actually go into that. No, let's not. Sorry, I'll make sense in a second. So I'm going to open this up in Explorer so you can see it. Give me 1 second to dig in there. Temp, and all right. So your folder, your project will have a couple different things baked into it. We're going to look at what's in the components folder. We're going to look at what's in the layouts and the pages and templates. By default, we have 2 pages, index and about, and I'm going to go ahead and run this develop server. And if we look at the existing pages, for example, the about page, again, this is just a single file component. So you have a template, you have a script block. If you wanted to, you could also have a style and a style scope block as well. This is already up and running. So let's take a look at that application. And again, it looks pretty similar. The about page is the one we just looked at in source. I'm going to go ahead and make a ray.vue. So make a new file, ray.vue, and I should get autocomplete. Thank you. So I'm going to intentionally make an error. I make errors on accident all the time, but I'm going to do a mistake I do all the time in Vue and forget to have my wrapping thing on it. So I'm going to say hello world. And yeah, even code is like, yeah, this is not right. This is how Gridsome will report errors to you. You can see it in the browser and it's pretty direct. That text may be a little bit small, but it's essentially telling me I need a root element. So I'll go back there and add that in. Add a p tag. And pardon the formatting. So it reloaded automatically, but I'm on the about page. I called my page Ray. So if I go to Ray, I'll see there, and it's hello world way in the corner there, and hopefully you could see it. But my routing is done, and if I wanted to, I could style that and etc. Now I will point out, notice that it does not have the layout, and we're going to talk about how to fix that in a second. So the next kind of feature that you'll want, you've added a page and Gridsome provided an automatic route to that. You probably actually want to link to that. So in Gridsome, you use a new tag called glink. It's a lot like router link, and it actually wraps router link. And you may wonder, like, why can't I just use router link? But one of the cool things that Gridsome will do is automatically prefetch that content. And it will even recognize when the link is in view. So if I use header links, then it's always in view. But if you can imagine scrolling down a page and I link to something else, Gridsome will recognize when that has actually scrolled into view and prefetch it at that point. And now this make that navigation that much quicker, which is pretty cool. If you're doing external links or if you're linking to an anchor tag internally, you're going to want to use a regular anchor tag instead. The good old A tag. And that's just an example of how it looks. I pass it to with my path, and I make sure I close it as well because I tend to forget that all the time. So to show you an example of that, I'm going to go to my little hello world here and just add one more paragraph. We'll link back home. I'll call it home. Close the glink, close the paragraph. And if we go back to our browser, oh, yeah, I totally did that on purpose. Having two root elements. I know Vue 3 is going to make that a bit nicer. So there we go. I have my home link, click back, and there we go. And if I wanted to, on the home page, I could add a link to my new page. So that's linking. What about layout? So that page is definitely missing the kind of default site layout. So you add layouts to wrap your content, to do a kind of a standard header and footer. You can declare it globally or include it in a page. The docs right now, and again, I'm going to keep mentioning the docs. The docs talk about how it can be declared globally. When you build a default Gridsome application, they do that for you already. The docs kind of make it seem like you have to, but just know that by default, it is done for you. Now, I'll show you where that happens. You use a slot in your layout file to specify where the content should go. Layouts can have props, which is pretty cool. So if you want your layout to conditionally show a sidebar, you can make that a prop and then disable it where it makes sense. You can also have multiple slots. So if you want your page to say, here's my main content, and here's another set of content that's for another part of my layout file, it supports that. You can also define a master layout where every single page will make use of it, and you don't have to actually type the particular layout tag in. And that will make more sense in a second. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to show you the layout file. And again, this is what the default scaffold built. It's called default.vue. You could see the slot right here on line 12. That's where my content's coming in. This is that little header bar on top. Let's go ahead and add one for Ray. The path was Ray and the name was Ray. And then if I want to actually add the layout file, if you look at about, it's literally the layout tag. And again, because the Gridsome default project makes layout available globally, I can just use it. So I'll go in Ray, I'll replace div with layout. Like that, and we go back to the example application. And here's my Ray link. And there's my page now using the layout. And you can definitely have multiple layouts. You can have one layout include another. I mentioned that I would show you how it was loaded by default, and that is in main.js. So they import that particular file, and then they set it right there on line 8 to be globally available. So again, that's the default. Docs imply it isn't. If for some reason you want to not have that, then you certainly can as well. But then you'll want to make sure that you import your layout and any pages that you use. So far, so good. All right, so components. Good news about this, you put them in the components folder that the scaffold makes for you out of the box. You import them, and that's it. So Gridsome does not do any magic at all with components. Outside of building a folder for you, so you have a place to put it, which is kind of nice. There's nothing kind of magical done in that regard. So if I build a component live, and I will call it cat.view, and we'll do a quick template, meow, and close it. So in theory, I can go into, let's say, Ray, and add a script block. And I'm just gonna steal the one from, I am not gonna steal any of them. I am just going to import cat from squiggly components cat. And then at this point, default, I should have able to do this. And at this point, I should be done. And now I can actually go in here and say cat, close it, and it should just work. And because I typed this live, and I see it's complaining right there, wrong closing quote. Because I typed this live, I probably screwed it up. Oh, it didn't. I'm not shocked at all. But so again, there's absolutely nothing different or special about how you use components in a Gridsome application. Just works, which is what you want. So we talked about pages, we talked about the routing, we talked about layouts. So we haven't actually talked about data yet. And again, this is kind of Gridsome's big selling point, is working with data. So you have a GraphQL server available during development. And just to be clear, when you ship the end product, you're not shipping a GraphQL server. That's only local. What's cool about this is that Gridsome does everything for you. You don't have to actually set yours up and specify a port and stuff like that. It just fires it up and does it for you. You will then begin to import data from different places, and where you import your data is based on what you're actually building. And we'll see some examples of that, and hopefully it'll make a bit more sense. Gridsome will do a ton of crap with the data you do, that you do import. So I'm not showing an example of this, but for example, when you import your blog, 10,000 Markdown files of data into the GraphQL server, Gridsome will enable automatic pagination. So you can, show 10 blog posts at a time. So Gridsome will kind of do all that stuff for you. And even things like when I say blog posts refer to tags, it'll do all that connection, all that GraphQL low-level stuff for you, and you really don't have to think about how that's set up. Once you've done that, you can then use your data in pages and in components in layouts as well. And you have a GraphQL Explorer automatically deployed. And if you go back to the CLI, you can see when I started up my server, it's actually telling me where that particular server is set up, where the Explorer server is set up. Do note that it's 3 underscores. On my laptop, the font I have for my terminal isn't nicely separated like that. So the first couple of times I tried it, I was guessing like, oh, is it 1, is it 2, is it 3, is it 4? But no, it's 3. So stealing an image from the docs, because I thought this was actually rather well done. But so Gridsome supports a variety of different ways to get data in. But once you do, it's just a GraphQL layer. And whether it came from files or remote APIs, you just have it in GraphQL, and then you can make use of it in your pages, components, etc. Again, Gridsome does an excellent job of just making that available to you. So in terms of importing, actually creating this GraphQL data, you have kind of two main ways of doing that. The first is to import from an API, and that just kind of works out of the box. And when I say import from an API, the example they use in the docs is using Ajax, or I'm sorry, not Ajax, as it's server side, but doing a network call to hit a remote API. You don't have to actually do that. You can, for example, read the file system and get a set of files from there. So don't think it just has to be remote APIs that you're hitting. You can open a connection to a Mongo database, for example, and get your content that way. But essentially what you'll do is get your data somehow in JavaScript, and then you'll add this to the GraphQL layer. You can also import other ways, so like from files and WordPress and stuff like that. And for that, you have to use a plugin. Gridsome has a plugin ecosystem. I couldn't necessarily tell you how deep it is. I know I tested two things, and the first thing worked fine. The second thing, there was no plugin for it. So that could have just been my bad luck. But there's a plugin API, so in theory, you could write your own if one doesn't exist. Or it could help somebody build one as well. So when we talk about importing dynamically, you will make use of a file called gridsome.server.js. This is created by default and it's empty. You'll see an example of that in a second. But then once you've done that, you'll hit your API, or you'll read the file system or whatever. You'll make a collection, and then you'll add that to the GraphQL system. So a collection is essentially a type of data that you'll want to query later in your GraphQL store. Okay, so that was a lot. Let me show you an example here, and I'll show a real example in a second. But this is part of the gridsome.server.js. In this particular example, doing a network call against Axios. Notice, wait, actually, I'll get back to that in a second. Once I have my data, I can then use the Gridsome APIs to add a collection where I give it a name and then iterate over my remote data and then add to that node. One thing I will point out, if you're doing anything asynchronous in here, you have to use the async flag on this. So Gridsome knows essentially to wait until you're done. I ran into a bad bug last night where I was doing file system stuff and it was asynchronous, and I was having a timing issue where I was running add node, but I was actually running after Gridsome was kind of done, and it caused all kind of issues. So something to kind of keep in mind if you work with this. So I'm going to show you an example. And so first I'll show the default gridsome.server.js. It's empty, and then I'm going to steal some code that I've already written, and not this one. No, I want, don't look at the other files I'm looking at yet. Here we go. I'm going to steal this, and we'll go back to the one I just made right here. Okay, so I'm just going to blow this away. So this code looks like what I had on the slide. In this case, though, I'm going to be hitting the Star Wars API to ask for films. I'm using add collection, which basically says, hey, for the GraphQL server, we're making a new type called film. And then when I get my data, I'm just going to iterate over it and save it. A couple of things here. Axios is not included by default, so I just npm I it. And before I continue, let me actually do that. Since my network stuff is going horribly slow today for some reason. I'll take a sip of water. The other thing that I want to point out is anytime you work in Gridsome server.js, you will need to kill the server and restart it. One kind of nice thing is that you can add console.log messages. So If you want to look at the data coming back from your remote API, if you want to do some try catching and look for errors or whatever, you can debug that way and kind of see it as it starts up. So we'll wait for Axios to load. Again, you know, because I complained about Windows Subsystem for Linux, which I absolutely love, it's being extra slow. I can say Microsoft, like their next big update, they're going to have a Windows for Subsystem Linux 2, which will have much faster file I/O. So this will be less of an issue. It doesn't bug me enough where I've decided to stop using it. In fact, this one particular feature is what got me off of Mac and back onto Windows. So we'll give it a few more seconds. Come on. Yeah, this was just really, really bad tonight. I'm gonna blame everybody doing Netflix. That's what I'm gonna do. Everyone's clogging the tubes of the internet, making NPM slow. I could have used Yarn, maybe it would have been a bit quicker, but hopefully. And this, I believe, is the last time I'm NPM importing tonight. So this is the last time I'll make you sit here and be bored while you watch me install, you know, half the internet to install an NPM package. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Come on. Oh my goodness, it's just Axios. So when this is done, I'm going to restart up the server. And what we're going to do is look at the GraphQL Explorer, and we'll see, in this case, it's a type called film. I'm going to show you that thing added to GraphQL and also some of the side things that Gridsome adds to it. Like I mentioned earlier, you get automatic pagination, which is really nice. You get the ability to query against all of your data, as well as to query against one particular aspect of your data. So Gridsome is definitely doing some nice sugar on top of just running GraphQL. It is doing a lot to kind of make it easier to use. Yeah, I swear, I have never seen it this slow before. Oh my goodness. Maybe if I make the window bigger, it'll make it quicker. And again, I apologize. You know what? We are not going to wait for this to finish because, and I'm saying that, but I'm seeing it move a little bit quicker. I'm gonna give this like 5 more seconds and then we'll move on. I can come back and show this in a minute. Yeah, you know what? I am gonna come back to this because I don't want to make y'all wait anymore. Because the next part, I'm just gonna talk about, actually not show a demo. So if you want to import from files, there are plugin options for that. The one that you'll probably use is one called Filesystem. The docs mention it quite a bit. Know that this plugin by itself is not enough. If you're working with Markdown, you'll have to actually install another plugin to have the Filesystem plugin to be able to understand how to work with Markdown. There are some huge caveats to working with this that are not documented. And if you read my blog, and I have a link to one particular entry here, one of the things I point out that's not documented is that if you're using front matter in your Markdown, this gets automatically added to your GraphQL collection of data. So for example, on my blog, when I use Markdown, I have a property called banner image, which is the top level image that you'll see in a blog post. If my Markdown has that and I use that with Gridsome, then banner image will be one of the things that I could query against in GraphQL. So for Markdown, yeah, I mentioned this, you install the plugin and then you install that particular transformer for Markdown, and then you load the particular option in another file that we haven't seen yet called gridsome.config.js. This is an example of how it looks. By default, it's going to be pretty empty, the plugins part in particular. But essentially, name my plugin and then I define whatever option. So for the file system one, it wants to know what name do you want to use for the data, and then what path should it use. And it's using a typical glob there. So I want to see if, oh my goodness, why are you even compiling anything for Axios? Oh, that's a great demo fail for me. I'm going to show you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on, and I'm going to show the GraphQL Explorer a bit later, and a later example where it has things that are already running. I don't have to npm I anything. And because I said that, I'm going to quickly make sure I have this running for my next demo. So yeah, I love Node, I love npm, but like sometimes it goes down a rabbit hole of like literally installing the entire internet just to do stuff. So I'm sure it was worth it. Oh, hey, that finished. Great. So if we do Gridsome develop on that demo, which feels like an hour ago, where I hit the Star Wars API and defined a film collection of data. When this starts up, that server file is going to run, and we will be able to see it in the Explorer. And I'm going to open this up in a new tab, ___ Explorer. And if you have used GraphQL in the past, this is kind of the baked-in experience for exploring your data. Again, Gridsome just provides this automatically. And I can see that I have my film data right there. So if I were to write this from scratch, all film, edges, node, title, and I should get the title. So again, this data came from the remote Star Wars API. I used gridsome.server.js to load that and to add it to GraphQL, and I can now perform GraphQL queries against that data. So all we've covered so far is kind of how to import data and make it available to GraphQL. Now we got to kind of touch on actually using that data, and things get a little bit weird here. So Gridsome has a feature called a template. And a template is basically a way to say, for a GraphQL collection, I want to define both a path for where I want to output and a component that I want to render for that data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a folder under, I'll make a file under templates that's going to have the same name as what I just imported. And what's going to happen is that Gridsome can then, for each part of that collection, actually create one file from that template. This will make a lot more sense when we actually run it. And I'm going to fire that up real quick. And give me 1 second. I'm going to fire you up. Gridsome develop. And again, all these demos will be available for you to play with. Let's install that in the background. So firing up my server, let me show an example of this. This is in, if you are watching this later and have the source code, this is in template example. So in my Gridsome server, I'm hitting the Star Wars API. I'm adding to a collection called film. I can then, under my templates, create a component, a single file component called film. It has the same name. That's the first part of this. In this case, I define what my template's going to be. I have nothing dynamic now. We'll get to that in a second. I'm just doing, I'm a film. And the next thing I need to do is go on my configuration and essentially define what the path is going to be. And what this means is for each item in my template, in my GraphQL collection, I'm going to have a title. I'm going to have a path /films/title based on my GraphQL data. So that probably did not make a lot of sense, but now that I'm running and I know what Star Wars films are named, and I could tell by looking at, let's say right there, The Force Awakens, I'm going to come back, reload. This is my new one. And in theory, I could do film The Force Awakens and get it not working, but I can fix that real quick. Make sure I didn't typo anything. Oh, you know what? I need to lowercase, I believe. And this fails too. I have a way of making it work. So I'm not going to load it. I'm going to show an example in a second that will actually show you the URLs. What I'm going to do is just spit out the static version, and we're going to see how that template file gets laid out in folders. So it's building, and this should be much more quicker. And writing out, and done. 20 seconds, not too bad. If I look at template example and go into the disk folder, I could see, yeah, okay, I may have typoed the URL when I was doing it, but in case that's a bit hard to see, let me open up my Explorer here and go into template example, and this, again, this is the output, and there are my films. And again, these are so what was laid out was dynamic. The actual content is going to be just, I'm a film, which is not terribly exciting. So then let's look at how we can actually use this on a page. Now, I want to recap because I feel like this is a lot so far. We import our data into GraphQL. That's relatively straightforward. We define a template file, which is kind of a combination of things. It's where it's going to be laid out, as well as what's the component that's used to render that particular information. But we aren't actually showing anything dynamic. So all of my Star Wars films have the same name, which is not helpful at all. So to actually show your dynamic data on screen, you're going to use two different tags. Page query, which will allow for dynamic queries, and static query, which will be used for hard-coded non-dynamic queries. Basically, no arguments sent in. It's actually hitting the GraphQL layer still, but you would use it when you don't need arguments passed to it. To me, that's a little bit confusing. I have been leaning on just using page query only, and that's worked okay for me. How this works is that you go into your single file component, you just add a page query tag to it, and then you write your GraphQL query. Once you do that, it's going to be available to you in a variable called $.page. So you can see an example here where I'm doing a v4 over some data and then just rendering it out. So it's not too crazy. And I'm just, because I've been having such slow issues, I am going to run my example by npm install real quick. I swear I'm tempted to switch to command.exe just to see if it goes a little bit faster. So once you've done that, you could then start using it. So I'm going to go back a slide while I know npm is running. So the query that you run here, remember that you do have the playground. So if you're like me and you're still kind of new to GraphQL, definitely use this to play. So I know, for example, that I have a director field and I could test this on here. And I forgot I shut down the server, so it's not going to run. But essentially, if you're new to GraphQL and don't feel comfortable just kind of writing it by hand or writing it on the page and reloading, use the Explorer that comes with it and test your queries out. And again, what's nice is that once you're done, you can just drop that right into your page and then start using it. So I said that, and yeah, like I said, I'm having horrible luck today with this. So I'm going to show the source code of this particular demo so you can see it in action, and hopefully the npm install will be done sometime this century. So this is in a folder called page query. This has the same gridsome.server.js, so on startup, it's going to hit that Star Wars API and add it to the data. In my config, I am once again defining a path to go to my films, and I have in my source templates a film thing, but now I'm actually using the page query tag. And notice that code does not know how to color code that. I don't know if that's something that Gridsome will support with an extension going forward, but I can live with it being just one color for now. I am asking for the ID, the title, the content, and the release date. The ID is passed automatically to templates, and you could use it like I'm using it here to get the particular set of data that I'm working with. So all of my films have an ID, and I could query on that value. In my page up here, the actual layout, I'm just outputting it again using that page scope to address my data, and then just outputting whatever makes sense. So in theory, oh, and I have one more part. If I wanted to build a list of all my films, I did that in my index.vue page, and I queried against all film. And again, I mentioned that Gridsome does things automatically for you. I added a collection called film. It added all film for me to make it easier to query against all of that data. So in this case, I'm just building a typical kind of link list page that will go into my detail pages, and hopefully it's almost there. This will teach me not to forget to run npmi before my install. I apologize. I did most of my work on this slide deck and this presentation on my laptop, and am on my desktop now. So why are you so slow? Please hurry up so we can get done. I swear we are almost to the end, and I'm pretty much going to make sure I have the other guys all done. Yeah, I really did not think I had this many left to install, so hope you will forgive me. You could totally badmouth me on Twitter now for doing kind of a noob speaker mistake, even though I've been speaking for years and years. But I really didn't anticipate it being this slow. So you just started. So this really should be almost done. And actually, if there's any questions, I'm definitely willing to take them so far. I see all in the room. I see the two of you. You can unmute if you want and ask a question. I definitely do not mind while we wait for this. You can also unmute just to badmouth me for not being prepared properly.
No questions as of now, Raymond.
Okay. So I'm just going to sit here awkwardly waiting for this to finish. Like I said, now I'm 100% sure everything will be done from here. I may just move on, because the second I decide to move on, this is going to come back. You can trust me when I say this is going to work, and we could circle back to this. That way we're not waiting for this. I could actually kind of show a couple more things quickly while that's building. So talked about this. So just another kind of recap for how Gridsome is going to work in this regards is that you'll figure out what your source data is, whether it's a remote API or whether it's like Markdown files. You're going to import that. You will query your data, and you can optionally define a template for when you want to dynamically create multiple routes based on that data. In terms of more stuff, and I'm just doing a quick look here, seeing if you're, oh, I think you're done. Yay! All right, so Gridsome develop. This is going to be totally worth the wait. I promise you. You're going to be like, Ray, thank you for making me sit and watch npm install. Come on, buddy. 20 seconds at most. Come on. Come on, come on, come on, come on. All right, so we go back here. And remember, I built the, I queried against the GraphQL collection to get the data, to get all my movies. And now it's actually working. So what you're seeing now, is, again, comes from that template file. comes from me defining the path that I wanted to use for that, and for me importing the data. And there you go, a real example. Okay, I swear no more npm install. So I want to cover two more features I think are really neat. Again, there's a lot more to Gridsome than I can cover tonight. Dynamic pages and images. So dynamic pages are essentially creating pages via JavaScript. I kind of showed that already, right? I showed importing data and defining a GraphQL collection and all that. This is a feature where if you don't want to use GraphQL, you just want to say, hey, Gridsome, I want you to spit some stuff out. Those pages that you make can still use GraphQL data, and you'll use an API called create pages and create page. And I'm going to show an example of this, but I won't run it. And you'll have this in the repository that I'm going to share at the end. But this is essentially an example of, once again, hitting the Star Wars API, but I'm using the create page API to not only define where this stuff is going to be, but to also define the source for it. So I pass a path, I tell it the component to use, and in this term, in this example, context is the data that I want available to my template. In this case, it's a little bit different. Instead of doing a GraphQL query, because again, I'm skipping GraphQL, I use that context object to address the values passed in. So if for some reason you want to do something and not work with the GraphQL layer, this is what it looks like. Do notice that I had to add things like Slugify to get a proper URL. One of the weird things is that Gridsome definitely has Slugifying kind of built into it, but you don't have access to that. So I had to npm install it and then make use of it here. So that's an example of that particular API, and I think it's kind of nice that Gridsome supports it. The other kind of cool thing it supports is some really neat things involving images. So it has a tag called gimage that will do really cool things for it. Like, for example, using source set to create different sized images for you for different sized devices automatically. It will even do a blurred base64 version that will be there until you scroll into the viewport, and then it will lazy load it. And I love that that's kind of built in for you. And it'll even do resizing and cropping. So what's nice is that your art people can give you large unoptimized images, and while you're working with your site, you could say, hey, you know, it should really be this size, it should be cropped a bit. And what's cool is that when you build the static version of the site, it will do that final resize for you, and you don't have to worry about it. Now, it only works with local images. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. But I want to show kind of a lame example I built. And I know that this finished. There we go. Gridsome develop. I'm going to fire up this particular one if you want to test. My repository is called image_test. While this fires up, I will show you what I did. So I took a page, I added a bunch of BR tags just to scroll down. I put a large image called plain.png, and this is 639 pixels wide, so it's pretty big, but I told it to be 400. So what's nice is that when this is up and running, and it is, we'll go back here and we'll see it. And if I scroll down now, I'm not sure how well this will work streaming over video. So I'm gonna try slow scrolling, but it will be blurred until it hits the viewport. And what's nice is that if I actually open up DevTools and look at my network and look at just images and reload this, we should see it loaded the base64 version. It did not load that large plane until I scroll down, and you should see it. There we go. So I saw the blurred version. It probably didn't come over well over the stream, but it works really, really nicely. So that's a great feature. That's definitely not a major feature, but it's something that I just kind of saw and kind of thought was really, really neat. So again, there's definitely more to Gridsome than I could show tonight. There's some more involving the dynamic routing, much like how Vue Router supports dynamic routing. You definitely can do things with the head. So if you needed to add a particular JavaScript file or a CSS file to one particular page, there's a built-in API, again via Vue-Meta, to work with the head and make those types of changes. You can also work with client-side data, and this I feel is not documented terribly well. I know I keep saying that, but for example, I want my GraphQL data to be available on the client side. There's a way to do that. Essentially, when you build your static version, that data gets web-packed up in a way that you could use on the client side. I've talked about pagination. It is really baked in with great support for that. And there's more and more. Check the docs to see what else is in there. I really do kind of think I kind of covered the high level stuff in terms of, you know, working with pages and the routing and working with data. That's the high level stuff, and everything else is going to be extra for the most part. So finding help, definitely go to the docs. Again, keep in mind that I know personally I struggled with them a little bit. There is a Discord, and that's worked well. I'm not a big fan of chat because you kind of have to like pay attention to it, but I've also asked a question and gone to bed and checked in the morning, and I've seen a response there. So there are definitely some users in there that are very responsive and very helpful. So it has worked well, and I recommend it. And there is a Stack Overflow tag that you could check and ask questions or look for previous answers if you want. So I promised I would share the URL for my assets, and it's under my GitHub repository at /Gridsome presentation. And that is it for me. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I will see if anybody has any questions or if everyone's totally happy with that. And again, I apologize for making you sit through those NPM installs. I definitely dropped the ball on that. So thank you for your patience, and thank you for watching to this point. I really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, Raymond. And thank you for going over everything about Gridsome to our group today. And thank you for showing all the explaining in depth how you can the benefits of images, loading blur, and all other routing features and loading data from GraphQL through an API, Axios, and all those stuff. And I know it's too much heavy for a one meetup to cover Gridsome on a whole, and you did really well. Thank you for doing this to us, and thank you for joining us today. And with that said, do we have any other questions if you want to ask?
No questions, but after seeing this, I'm interested.
Okay. Yeah, so they are interested to try Gridsome after seeing your talk. So we'll let you know. Right.
Cool. Yeah, I certainly did not mean to push people away. I just, the warning about the docs, I think is good. So be ready and have fun.
Yeah, we have one more question here.
This is the problem. Did you hear me? Right?
He might not. So you have to come here.
Are we on video too?
Yeah.
Hi, right.
Hey.
Now, so I have a problem. I use Jekyll right now, and I have a problem, and you may not know the answer to this. It's kind of vague. I have a problem where I had to write custom plugins to get images to copy over when they were in the posts collection. I don't know if that makes any sense, but if I had a folder for an individual blog post, inside of that folder I had the Markdown file, which would become index. I was not able to put images side by side. I had to put them relative to the site root because Jekyll would not copy those when it did the deployment. it would do it for other collection types, but not posts, apparently.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a plugin for Jekyll to do that. Do you know if Gridsome does that?
No, I don't. But like literally, I was going to say I was going to test real quick. I think it does support it, and it does the whole Webpack optimization for images in that. There is a like static folder where you can put like header graphics and stuff like that. I'm 90% sure that works.
So there is a kind of assets folder or something where Gridsome will try to, when you have any images, it will try to build it and put everything into the assets folder. But if it is with Markdown, you need to have your images where the Markdown file is there. Like, for example, you have a folder.
You have to have them there anyway.
Yeah, within that, like there is a Markdown file, and you will put your image over there within that particular folder. Yeah, that's how I did it, and even Dan did the same way, Dan Vega. So I followed most of his blog post while mine. So, but still, there are, as you said, there are some things we need to like find out or research with most of the plugins, as you said.
Yeah, so speaking of images, I tried something today that I thought would be simple. Images just to make a picture page. Like I dropped 10 pages in and then have one page showing all 10, like an image gallery. Yeah. And no, it was not simple. Well, it wasn't simple if I wanted to use Gimage. Like I wanted that nice lazy loading. And somebody in the Discord actually showed an example of how to do it. And wow, I was like shocked. Like that, it was complex. So
I think they use something called asset loader or something when they load the images. It's not like a direct G image and give the image file name. Yeah, that's all we had here, Ray, today. Thank you for speaking to us, and it's really a good information on Gridsome. Thank you again.
You're most welcome, and thank you as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.